Today is the day you stop just watching TV and start playing it. Welcome to Sega Channel, the only channel where you actually play video games. Sega Channel pumps 24 hours of brain-blistering, thumb-twitching Sega action into your home. Sega Channel. This isn't cable TV you watch, it's cable TV you play. Your Genesis is hooked up to about 50 games a month. The hottest games like Sonic and Knuckles, Earthworm Jim, a special version of Super Street Fighter 2, and more. You get tips on secret moves and hidden levels, and only Sega Channel lets you test drive the newest games before they come out. Play what you want, when you want, for as long as you want for one monthly fee. Sega Channel. Stop just watching TV.
Before Game Pass, before Switch Online, before Game Tap, before Steam, Sega had a radical idea to send games directly to your console. In partnership with the cable television industry, they created Sega Channel. Sega Channel launched in the United States during the 1994 holiday season, promising subscribers access to a rotating library of dozens of games for Sega Genesis every month, ranging from Sega classics like Sonic the Hedgehog to brand new release games, trial versions you could sample at no additional charge, special game challenges, and even some exclusives that never came out in any other format. It was a big, bold idea that I think we can all agree was ahead of its time. But unfortunately, it did also have some execution issues as well. Sega Channel launched just a couple months before the US launch of the Sega Saturn, so it was sort of left out to die along with the Sega Genesis. It ran for a couple more years and then was discontinued in 1998. Unfortunately, because Sega Channel was, by design, a temporary service, there's really not a lot saved from the history of Sega Channel. And that's to say nothing about the games themselves that were distributed through the service, which, for a variety of reasons, are still largely unaccounted for. For the last 2 years, we've been working on a project to preserve more of the history of Sega Channel, and we are finally ready to show you what we've been up to. We've preserved some exciting archival materials that show how Sega Channel worked on the inside and what would have come next for the service. We've also preserved some Sega Channel data. We've got some big surprises for you, along with a couple things that, well, we know you've been waiting for. Let's start by talking about what Sega Channel was, so we all have the same baseline understanding here. There were two really unique things about Sega Channel. The first, and maybe the most obvious, was its technology. The idea of a digital game distribution system like Sega Channel didn't really exist at the time. There have been a few attempts at doing something like this with telephone lines, and that was really inefficient, and for the most part, those were either very short-lived or they really never made it out of R&D. And at the time, in 1994, nobody in the United States really had a broadband internet connection. But there was one connection that most people had, our good old friend here, coaxial cable. Coax cable, used for basic cable television, was probably the highest bandwidth connection that most people had in their homes in the 90s, so Sega Channel was designed to piggyback off of this. Sending video games over television cable is a pretty technically complicated process, and it took a lot of partnerships to make this work. Sega worked with two cable providers in the US, Time Warner, and especially closely with a now-defunct company called Telecommunications Inc. to transmit the data for games via cable. They also had to work with two separate companies to build the hardware that plugged into the Sega Genesis that would actually receive the cable and turn it into Genesis-compatible data. They worked with two companies, General Instrument and Scientific Atlanta. Remember those names, they are going to come back up later. The point is that it was a tightly coordinated effort to get Sega Channel to work. We're talking about 5 separate companies just to get the data from Sega to people's homes. And that's just in the United States. And that's before we even start talking about the games themselves and licensing content for Sega Channel, and more broadly, curating the content for the Sega Channel service. And that curation is the second unique thing about Sega Channel. It wasn't just a game distribution system. Every month, if you were a subscriber to Sega Channel, you would get an update sent to your Sega Channel cartridge with new editorial from the staff, things like game tips and hints, or even just updates about what was going on at Sega Channel that month. The staff at Sega Channel fully embraced this magazine-style approach, and they made up their own characters, their own Sega Channel sonas, I guess, that they would use to talk to fans. Characters like Psycho Cat and King Iguana. Fans would actually make art of these characters and mail them into Sega Channel, and then they would digitize those and send them out in the next Sega Channel update. It was its own whole ecosystem, and internally at Sega Channel, this was referred to as programming. Not programming in the sense of like coding, but programming like programming a television network. If you ever watched Nickelodeon or the Disney Channel back in the day, and you remember those tightly curated programming blocks with hosts and interstitials, Sega Channel was like that for video games. Of course, just by nature of what Sega Channel was, we really don't have a lot of documentation around the programming for Sega Channel. There have been a few oral histories of the company, and specifically we would recommend checking out Jack Yarwood's article about Sega Channel from a few years back, where he interviewed some of the staff members. We'll link to that in the description. But there really hasn't been a lot in terms of the material history of Sega Channel. That is, until we met a guy named Michael Shorrock.
Folks, welcome to FYE. We are coming to you from the Western Cable Show in Anaheim, California, which is the home of Disneyland. And this is kind of like the Disneyland of the world of cable, isn't it, Sonic? Absolutely. And Sonic actually is out here because one of the new channels coming to you folks out there soon will be the Sega Channel. Now, how does this work? Can you tell me? Go see some boss type people. All right, come here, guys. See, this whole Western show has all the new channels. The channels, some of them are already on, but some will be on next year. They're all the new, fresh channels, like the cable, like this, the Sega Channel. Now, tell me how this works. So, it's the Sega Channel, right?
Right.
So basically, people flip this channel on and they watch people playing video games. Is that how it works?
That's right. You don't watch people play, you play.
Wait a minute.
I can set you up with it. It's really easy.
Michael Shorrock was the vice president of programming at Sega Channel starting in late 1993. He was in charge of their programming team, so everything we just talked about with game selection and content was Michael's responsibility. Before his time at Sega Channel, Michael Shorrock had been working in educational software, which is actually how we met him. Do you remember this video from about 2 years ago when we went to the Game Developers Conference? We put on a miniature museum exhibit about unusual, interesting games from outside the traditional game industry. One of the games we exhibited was Where in North Dakota is Carmen Sandiego. We showed off some of the artifacts that our director Frank Cifaldi picked up when he went to North Dakota to excavate that game back in 2016. Do you see that brochure in the display case for Broderbund Educational Software? That's Michael Shorrock, right there on the cover. He was at GDC that year and he did see our exhibit. It has to be a little alarming to see yourself in a history exhibit, but Michael was really engaged, and we got talking with him about his work and his career. It turns out he had a lot of materials from the history of Sega Channel that he just had saved at home. He has allowed us to digitize those materials and share them with you. At the time this video is going up, we're opening a new collection in our digital library, the Michael Shorrock Collection. And we're going to take a look at this for a second and show you some of these materials that reveal how Sega Channel worked on the inside. Michael Shorrock's papers mostly break into 3 categories: company strategy, user experiences, and sales and marketing materials. But let's start this from the beginning. Shorrock had a folder labeled Objectives, and this is where you can learn a lot about how they were positioning the Sega Channel service. There were obviously concerns about the technical end of Sega Channel and deciding what games to license, but a lot of Michael Shorrock's responsibility involved overseeing the identity of Sega Channel. Much of what's covered in this folder is about developing standards to make Sega Channel stand apart as a desirable but also unique service. There's an unspoken thread running through these documents about figuring out who the audience for Sega Channel was and what resonated with them. Originally, Sega Channel's lead technician, Patrice Jones, said that their goal should be to get up to 100% of Sega Genesis owners to sign up for the service, but they acknowledged that was probably not realistic. So, in mid-1994, Sega ran a series of test markets for Sega Channel to give them a better idea of who their likely users were and what they were responding to. Michael Shorrock kept a copy of the results, and they provide some interesting data points that helped them shape the service. In terms of the audience, they found that Sega Channel's test users were generally more age and gender diverse than the general Sega Genesis market. It's not a huge difference. Their audience was 20% female and about a quarter of users over the age of 25. This was still eye-opening to the Sega Channel staff, and they noted that this was an opportunity to try to expand and diversify their audience beyond the typical demographics of Sega Genesis players. Many of these users were new Genesis owners who maybe didn't already have a backlog of games to get through and benefited from getting a monthly sampler pack of titles. There's some interesting data in here about what games were popular, and it seems to match what we've seen from other subscription services. Although they acknowledge that the most popular titles on Sega Channel matched up pretty closely with what was popular at retail, there was a notable trend. Arcade games like Ultimate Kicks and Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine had surprisingly high replay value compared to classics like Sonic the Hedgehog. Just from raw numbers, only about 80% of their test users played games in the classics category, compared to 98% who played arcade games. You wouldn't expect Mean Bean Machine of all things to be a breakout hit, but a subscription-based gaming buffet like Sega Channel encourages players to try smaller replayable games instead of the usual pattern of dropping their allowance on one big title every couple of months. That's the sort of behavior that, a whole decade later, the game subscription platform GameTap leaned into by focusing on arcade classics with leaderboards rather than exclusively filling out their service with first-run PC titles. From there, you can look at the schedules that Sega Channel set for their internal production. We have one schedule from the lead-up to launch, which includes some time budgeted in to redesign their system after their test market, which is some good forethought. We also have one schedule from their content production and licensing side from October 1997, which shows that they were planning their content far in advance. Based on this somewhat optimistic schedule, their content packages were due to be finished about a month before they would ship to cable companies, and about 2 months before the content would actually air. There's that television language again. Not transmitted to users, Sega Channel content was aired, like a TV show. If you want to know how this programming did, throughout Michael Sharrock's collection, he kept a handful of user surveys that reveal information about who was playing what on Sega Channel. If you want to see exactly who was playing, let's say Shining Force 2 in February 1995, well, there you go. You get a breakdown by gender, age, household income, and even what region of the country they were in. We're not sure why this is, but proportionally, Midwestern users of Sega Channel played the most Shining Force. 36% of people they surveyed in the Midwest who played Shining Force 2 went back to it 20 or more times. As we mentioned, Michael Sharrock saved a lot of marketing and sales material for Sega Channel. It's fun to be able to look at some of these vintage advertisements and brochures, but there's also some information in here about the non-consumer facing side of Sega Channel marketing. This is Sega Channel marketing their service to local cable affiliates to sell to customers. So there's summaries of the TV and radio campaigns they were going to run and the promotions they were going to hold. One of the common themes throughout this collection is how aggressively Sega Channel did tie-in marketing with anyone who was willing, really. For instance, they had a tie-in with Pauly Shore's movie Biodome, where you could win Biodome-related prizes for telling them which Sega Channel game you'd want to be trapped in the Biodome with for a whole year. The answer, of course, is Chessmaster. They went even more aggressive on sports tie-ins. On this VHS tape that was labeled Media Impressions, we get a supercut of athletes stumping for Sega Channel, like Houston Rockets center Hakeem the Dream Olajuwon rocking a Sega Channel shirt before the start of a game, and here's Mario Lemieux playing Mario Lemieux hockey on Sega Channel with some lucky kid. They actually got a pretty good soundbite out of him too.
To spend roughly $15 a month and have to choose from 50 games on the Sega Channel, and that's a great idea.
Since we're already talking about VHS tapes, Michael Sharrock had a ton of these too. In fact, every promo we've shown in this video came from Michael Sharrock. These are a real treat, especially the commercials, because they show how Sega Channel was selling their service to the public. As you might expect from the 90s, it's a lot of kids misbehaving and saying no to school and parents.
This is the best way to get your math homework done.
And this is the best way to get video games.
Mom, why don't you get us some more video games? Please, more video games. Please, more video games. Please, more video games.
They want video games, but for some odd reason, you don't want to go out. Now, through the miracle of cable TV, Sega Channel brings the games to you.
All right, have you heard about Sega Channel?
Cable Channel, the whole family plays.
Jumps up to 50 super odd games on you each month.
All you need is cable TV.
Sega Genesis.
The Sega Channel adapter.
Sega Channel has mega new games. And if you know who calls,
Call your cable company now to get it all.
Sega Channel, unlimited on-demand play.
There's also one videotape that we have to talk about before we move on. In 1995, Sega Channel produced a series of public service announcements featuring TLC. Like, this was right after Crazy Sexy Cool came out. They were just blowing up when they did these. According to a press release we have from Michael Shorrock, the idea was to help kids take their enthusiasm for beating video games and, I guess, apply that same energy to the challenges they face in real life.
Do you have a problem, Lisa?
Who, me?
Yeah, that you need advice about?
You here to help me today?
As much as I can, yeah.
I'm here to help you too.
Sometimes you look better looking on the outside than the inside.
Don't think that you're alone. TLC has gone through stuff. We're still going through stuff, and we're here. We have made it, and we have ourselves today too. And we love ourselves and believe in yourself. Yeah.
You might have noticed there was nothing about Sega Channel or video games in there. We did find a YouTube upload of this ad that has the Sega Channel logo, so they must have added that afterwards, and it's just missing from this tape copy, which came from the place that made the commercial. If you think back to those test market results from earlier, Sega Channel said they saw a chance to expand the demographics of their users beyond the typical audience for game consoles at the time. And in that light, the fact that they commissioned a series of inspirational ads featuring a black women R&B group is super interesting. This is not something you typically saw out of game publishers or platform owners at the time, and it's kind of a welcome antidote to those other ads with suburban boys yelling at their mom or whatever. Also, the end result is that Sega paid TLC a bunch of money to go to the beach for a day, which is something we can get behind. We loved that Michael Shorrock also kept a folder of the artwork that kids sent into Sega Channel that we talked about earlier. Look, there's Psycho Cat and there's King Iguana on this drawing dated June 1996. One kid went really over the top and made an entire comic book, which is actually pretty decent, and it's fun to preserve this. Let's pause on this drawing, though. This illustration of Kurt Hedgehog fighting Psycho Cat was sent to Sega Channel around, well, based on the very faint number stamp on the back of this page, compared with other submissions, we think this would have been around early 1996. Is this the first Sonic OC? Like, is Kurt the first person to do Your Name the Hedgehog? Is that even possible to know? This is like finding a photograph of the first caveman discovering fire. If your Sonic OC fan art predates this one, please scan it, because as far as we know right now, Kurt Hedgehog is where it all began. Kurt, whoever you are, wherever you are, we salute you. This is all very interesting, I'm sure especially to Sega Channel fans, but the thing that interested me the most was that Michael Shorrock was one of the people who was in charge of figuring out what the successor to Sega Channel was going to be. We've heard people asking why they didn't bring Sega Channel to Sega Saturn, but it turns out they had their sights set somewhere different. They wanted to bring it to PC. Many of Michael Shorrock's documents are about a proposed service called Express Games, which would have brought their service to PC without the Sega-specific branding. They had already been using Express Games as a brand for putting new release titles on Sega Channel, but the plan seems to have been to replace Sega Channel entirely in their business model with this new PC service. As we mentioned at the start of this video, the Genesis was on its way out by the time Sega Channel launched. One of the proposals from Shorrock explains somewhat bluntly that by 1998, quote, "The number of Genesis consoles in active use continues to decline and the library of Genesis titles has ceased to expand." That wasn't when Sega Channel's problems began, though. Shorrock also saved a memo from late 1995 in which, even that early on, they recognized that the Sega Channel concept had an inherently limited audience. The idea of an endless supply of games every month really only ended up appealing to the most hardcore gamers. If you remember from their test market study, they found that new Genesis owners were more likely to adopt Sega Channel than people who had had the console for longer because they didn't already have a cartridge library. Sega Channel was not eating into game sales, but it turns out game sales did eat into Sega Channel. For most Genesis owners, once you had bought the handful of games that you liked, there wasn't a good reason to spend $15 a month to get a rotating selection of other games. So an average Genesis user, or a moderate user as they called them in this memo, wasn't incentivized to keep their subscription going long term. So with this in mind, Sega Channel's next move was to repurpose the existing data delivery infrastructure they had set up with Time Warner and TCI and move it to a new platform. The reason they chose PC over Sega Saturn is that they saw a completely different market they could tap into. They weren't going to focus on hardcore gamers again, and based on their market research, they explicitly ruled out launching an online game service. Sega had actually already tried that in 1997 with Heat.net, which ended up being a flop, although it's not clear that this influenced Sega Channel's decision. Instead, their research indicated that there was huge growth potential with families, which were adopting PCs in high numbers. Based on this report, their ideal market was affluent families, perhaps with more women in the household, who were less plugged into what was happening in the gaming space. They also talked about the subset of, quote, technophobic households, which were skeptical to the idea of a subscription gaming service at all, but could be convinced to sign up for one if it had proven value for their families. So rather than going hard on action and arcade titles like Sega Channel did, they wanted to focus more on educational and family games. Just by launching a PC service with action games, they could probably get some of the hardcore audience to sign up. But there was an untapped market for families that maybe weren't technically savvy enough to care what kind of kilobaud modem they had, but they would pay a monthly premium for an easy-to-use service built on top of their existing cable subscription that gave them a library of games for the whole family. Consider how much the average American family was spending every year on Wishbone VHS tapes, and this starts to sound like a good deal. From another source, which we'll talk about later, we received this interactive mock-up of what the Express Game service would have looked like. This was created with Macromedia Director, and it's not a functional piece of software. It's just meant to give you an idea of how it would work. Perhaps this was something that they brought when they were pitching the Express Games PC concept to cable companies, which we know for a fact they were doing. We have copies of the presentations that Michael Shorrock gave to TCI and at an annual conference for the cable industry, so we know that this was being actively pitched to their partners in the cable business. At a time when internet adoption was just starting to take off in the United States and we saw all sorts of weird internet gadgets coming out for computers, the idea of delivering data to a computer using a television cable connection was still a pretty novel idea, albeit one that the cable companies didn't end up going for. We talked with Michael Shorrock about what happened to Sega Channel towards the end, and by his recollection, the reason Sega Channel even happened in the first place was because of the company's president, Stan Thomas Jr. He was the one who got all those various parties involved to make Sega Channel happen. He was a black gaming pioneer, and someone we rarely talk about these days. Unfortunately, Stan Thomas passed away just a few months after Sega Channel launched. As Michael Shorrock remembers him, he was the organizing force and energy that really made Sega Channel possible, and in his absence, the project lost momentum and eventually just fizzled out. It's hard to say what Sega Channel would have become if Stan Thomas was still with us, but whatever the factors were, this future where Sega was a major player in video game distribution for computers never came to pass. We wanted to sit down with Michael Shorrock for our podcast, The Video Game History Hour, but we weren't able to get that together in time for this video. But we are going to have him on the show in the near future, so stay tuned for that. Now, in addition to all these documents and videos, Michael Shorrock also shared some Sega Channel data with us in various forms, such as test cartridges like this one here, which contained test versions of games or the Sega Channel operating system, in addition to prototypes that were sent to Sega Channel for evaluation, and a CD that contained the data that Sega sent to cable companies to deliver to Sega Channel users. Now, I'm sure your eyes are bulging out of your head. We're going to get back to this in a second, but we have to put Michael Shorrock's story on pause for a second, because there actually was somebody else we were talking to who had also come into a large amount of Sega Channel data. This wasn't one of the Sega Channel staff. It was actually a community member who goes by Sega Channel Guy. His actual name is Ray, but we're going to call him Sega Channel Guy for this video because that's a lot more fun. But he's a super fan of Sega Channel and has been contacting people who were involved with the company to see if they may still have anything around from back in the day. He reached out to us because he got in contact with someone who had internal data backups from Sega Channel from 1995 and mid-1997. If you've never had to work with a data tape before, Don't. It's a terrible format. It's a nightmare. There's so many different standards for it. We barely know how to work with these things internally. So whenever we had a project come along that used a data tape, we usually outsourced it to a guy named Chuck Guzis, who ran a data recovery company called Cydex up in Eugene, Oregon. He's one of the only people who I would say really had a mastery over all the various data tape formats. Now, to give you an idea how precarious this kind of work is, I actually just learned a few hours before this recording that Chuck passed away this summer. This is really difficult work, and I'm so glad we were able to work with him in the past, but I don't know who we're going to turn to on projects like this in the future. This is a serious entreaty to you watching this video. If you've wanted to get more involved with video game preservation and you have a lot of interest in old hardware formats, this might be a skill you can learn. We need people to know how to do this kind of stuff. We really need this kind of work to be sustainable in the future. So please, seriously, consider it. This is how you can get involved with the world of video game preservation. But at the very least, Chuck did rip the data from these tapes. And for the last 2 years, we've been working with Sega Channel Guy to sort through all the data he's been recovering. There was so much documentation on these tapes, and most of it is not ready for public consumption just yet. We're still working with Sega Channel Guy to figure out what we can ethically and legally share from this collection. We do want to get this stuff up in our digital library, but given the scope of this project, we do not have a timeline for getting through this stuff. But Sega Channel Guy did think to look through the files and discovered that there is a significant amount of game data in these backups as well. And it's all in a format that we couldn't read.
Most of us aren't interested in fiddling with hookups and wires to get a cable program going on our televisions. Technology should make life simpler, not more difficult. With Sega Channel, hookup is a piece of cake. The Sega Channel plays exactly like the Sega games that you can purchase or rent on cartridges. A handy adapter available from your cable company plugs into the Genesis platform. You turn on the Sega Genesis and the TV, and up comes the Sega Channel screen. From the menu, choose your game category and then pick your game. It downloads, and that's it.
That's it. Yeah, if only it was that easy for us. Time for a quick primer on how the Sega Channel data format worked. When Sega sent out their data to cable companies, they didn't just give them a bunch of raw ROM files or cartridges, they made little packages of compressed data containing games as well as system updates. They could contain at most 3 megabytes of uncompressed data. As a result, some larger games had to be broken up into multiple pieces or had content removed, or instead they were offered up as demo versions. The tricky part in this process is the adapter that you saw earlier, which actually converted the cable data for use on the Sega Genesis. Each cable equipment manufacturer had their own Sega Channel hardware, and each piece of hardware had its own standard. So there's 2 formats to deal with here, one for General Instrument and one for Scientific Atlanta. See, I told you those names were going to come back. The Sega Channel data we recovered was in both formats. Michael Shorrock's CD was in GI format, and the data we got from Sega Channel Guy used a combination of GI and SA. When we first tried to tackle this problem, we had our volunteer digital conservator, Rich Whitehouse, take a look at the files and compare them against known retail versions of Genesis games to see if he could decipher the format. He had success cracking the SA format, but not the GI files. Then, by complete coincidence in the middle of all this, last November, a user on the Sonic Retro forums named Rising from Ruins shared that he had also come across a data disk similar to the one that Michael Shorrock had. A user named InfoChunk dug into the format and found that somebody had anonymously uploaded the documentation for the GI and SA formats to GitHub 8 years ago. So, that made things easier. We built our own decompression tools from the source code and successfully decompressed the data we had come across. We took everything that Michael Shorrock gave us, we took everything that Sega Channel Guy gave us, we combined it together, we compared it against retail versions of games, we compared it against known prototypes, we narrowed it down to just the unique data, and what we had in the end was pretty remarkable. Now, I'm aware that a lot of you watching this video right now know that we have recovered a Sega Channel exclusive video game. In fact, we actually showed it off at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo in 2024 while we were in the middle of this project. We are going to talk about that. But there's a lot more to this project that we haven't told you about. This isn't just about one game. We've recovered over 100 previously undumped Sega Channel ROMs. Alright, I assume we got your attention. Before we go any further with this, I want to talk for a second about why we are doing this video right now. First off, for one thing, it really did take us this long to get through everything and get it ready for public consumption, I promise. I know folks have been waiting for updates about this project, and thank you for your patience. Given the scope of what we're doing here today, I hope it's clear how much work we've put into this, and I hope in the end that it's worth it. But also, at the time this video is going up, this month is the Video Game History Foundation's annual winter fundraiser. Every year, we depend on your support to help our nonprofit organization keep growing, and we want to show you what a difference your support makes to our organization. 2025 has been the biggest year ever for the Video Game History Foundation. We're a small team. We're just 2 people full-time in addition to our volunteers who help us. And we want to show you that your support really does make a huge impact in what we're able to do every year. This is the year we finally launched our digital library, which now has around 4,000 text-searchable game magazines and mountains of one-of-a-kind development materials from creators of games like Spyro the Dragon, Toe Jam and Earl, the Myst series, and so much more. We've been able to travel the country running pop-up exhibits and booths and hosting panels, like our once-in-a-lifetime talk at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo, where we reunited the staff from Nintendo of America who launched the NES in 1985. We've given back to the game industry by helping Game Informer and EGM preserve their own back issues of magazines. Materials in our archives have even been used in commercial games like Mortal Kombat Legacy Collection. We even did some totally unique projects that we don't think any other game history group has ever done before. We acquired the rights to one of the earliest video game magazines and put the rights out into the world for free. And then, we acquired the rights to an unfinished NES game, we brought in a group to finish the game, and then released it on cartridge 34 years after development originally started. You can actually pre-order that game right now from IM8bit, with the revenue going to help our nonprofit. Whew. We do a lot around here, and your support for us seriously makes a difference. This year for our fundraiser, we're just asking for direct donation support. But if you want to, you can also sign up for our Patreon, you can get some VGHF merchandise, or you can subscribe to get a mystery retro magazine for you or for a friend as a gift. Head on over to gamehistory.org/donate to get started. Okay, now with that out of the way, let's talk about these ROMs. Alright, right off the bat, a couple explanations. First thing, this video is only covering unique ROMs that we recovered. A lot of what we were able to get in these collections is already available on websites like Sonic Retro or Hidden Palace. We're not covering that stuff. We're only talking about unique ROMs that have previously not been documented. And secondly, yes, you will be able to access all of this data. We are donating this to the folks at Gaming Alexandria who will be hosting the ROMs in case you want to get a closer look at them. They are probably putting those files up right now as we speak. As this video is premiering, we will have a link in the description as soon as it is available. But for now, we gotta get moving because there is so much still we have to cover in this video. By volume, the biggest chunk of what we recovered is Sega Channel menu data. There's already a few dumps of Sega Channel menus out there. What we have is the menu data that was sent to subscribers for basically every month from 1995 to mid-1997. These are a great historical resource because you can use them to figure out what games were being distributed through Sega Channel every month. It's rare that we find even one of these, but the quantity we have here is pretty astounding. This is also where you can find all that programming content we were talking about earlier. In fact, some of that fan art that Michael Shorrock shared with us ended up in these menu ROMs. This batch also includes the data for the Sega Channel game guides, and not just for the United States. There's data in here for a bilingual French-English version for Canada, as well as a separate bilingual version for Chile and Argentina. We don't know if anything has been recovered from the South American localization of Sega Channel until now. This part of the collection also has a number of prototypes and tests from the development of the Sega Channel menu, going all the way back to November 1993. This one menu cartridge from Michael Shorrock, numbered 374, is, to our knowledge, the earliest surviving build of the Sega Channel menu. There's kind of nothing here. According to Sega Channel Guy's research, there was a lot of development on the system software in November, and this is the earliest state we've ever seen it in. These early builds are fascinating because they show how the Sega Channel imagery was changing before it was finalized. The earlier versions have a more playful, toyetic look to them compared to the harder edge of the final version. There's that shaping of the brand identity that Shorrock was responsible for. Sega Channel Guy also found some wild software tests in these files, like a mock-up for a digital magazine called Hooked In, and a proof of concept for a Hangout Zone app for Sega Channel called Pat's Lounge. I guess the Sega Channel mascot character is named Pat. Most remarkably, there are several demos for a Sega Genesis web browser that was being developed for Sega Channel by Foley High Tech. From the limited sandbox here, our guess is that it worked by rendering a website on the side of cable companies and then transmitting a horribly compressed image to the Sega Genesis with data about where the hotspots were. According to the company's founder, David Foley, the Web Blaster, as it was called, was fully functional even though it didn't end up shipping. But it's still remarkable to see it even half functioning in a demo like this. And funny enough, side note, you can access a debug menu in the web browser, which seems to reveal that the browser was built on top of an unreleased port for Michael Jordan Chaos in the Windy City for Sega Genesis, which was also being developed by Foley High Tech. I don't really know what to do with that information, but there's layers to this. In total, these menu files and prototypes account for 97 new ROM files. Now let's talk about the games. Many of the games in our set contain mild differences in header data, which is to say, all that's really different between these and the retail versions is the metadata about the game, like its internal title, or build date, or region. For the most part, we didn't include these because there's actually not that much interesting about them. It's mostly just that the headers are corrupted. But we did include the ones that were on Michael Shorrock's CD for the sake of completion there, as well as any unique regional variants. For instance, there was never a cartridge release of the game Power Drive in the United States, so the copy we recovered that says Sega Genesis in the header instead of Mega Drive, that is technically the official US version, even though that's the only difference. After we filtered it out to just the interesting ones, that's 6 additional ROMs. There's also a handful that have meaningful data differences from the retail game. We couldn't determine exactly what those differences are, but for instance, the Japanese exclusive game Pulseman by Game Freak did get released in the US over Sega Channel, and that version predates the retail Japanese game by a full month. It might just have a few missing bug fixes or last-minute polish, but we'll leave that for the fans of Pulseman to figure out. These count for another 5 ROMs. A significant number of the games we recovered are special Sega Channel variants of titles that were released at retail. These were sometimes demo test drive versions of larger games, or special contest editions, like the Great Earthworm Jim Race. This version has a secret area that tells you how to enter a Sega Channel contest, but we couldn't actually figure out where that secret area was. If you are the first person to find it, let us know because you will have won this contest 30 years too late. There's actually a few other variants of Earthworm Jim called video hints, which show some pre-recorded gameplay to help you get through difficult sections of the game. It's a pretty novel use of Sega Channel to do something with game content besides just deliver you a game file. More interestingly, we now have the ROMs for all of these special Part A and Part B editions of Sega Channel games. Since Sega Channel games had a 3 megabyte file size limit, the bigger games had to be broken up into multiple chunks to deliver them. For linear games like Sonic 3D Blast, that just meant dividing the game into 2 parts, like splitting a game across multiple discs. But for fighting games, they had to split the rosters in half. For Mortal Kombat 3, for example, that meant that Sub-Zero was in version A, but Sonya was in version B, and they would never be able to fight each other. I guess it's better than no Mortal Kombat, but it would have been a real bummer to have 2 half-finished games instead of 1 complete one. Sometimes they just cut out content entirely to make it fit. Remember that commercial at the very beginning of this video where they bragged about the special version of Super Street Fighter 2?
A special version of Super Street Fighter 2.
It's special because it's missing half the characters. Like, yeah, technically it's a Sega Channel exclusive because it's the only version of Street Fighter 2 where you can't play as Ken. Rounding up all these variants and limited editions, that's another 19 new ROMs. So far, we've only covered content that was sent out through Sega Channel, but we also have some other cool bonuses. We have, as I mentioned earlier, prototypes that were sent to Sega Channel staff for evaluation. And for the most part, these are games that never actually came out. There's a couple prototypes in here for sports games that never saw the light of day. Al Unser Jr.'s Road to the Top and Dan Marino's Power Play Football. There's apparently some confusion about what this game was actually called. We can confirm it's called Dan Marino's Power Play Football. And there's a prototype for a golf game that was never even announced, a very unfinished Mega Drive port of Nick Faldo's Championship Golf. And also in here is an unannounced port of the computer game Wrath of the Demon. It seems pretty functional, just without audio, and the controls are still very Amiga, which is to say, you press up to jump. Also, from Sega Channel Guys data, this game did come out, but we think it's going to be interesting to fans of the developer Treasure. It's a build of Light Crusader from April 1995 between the Japanese and American releases. This is a localization prototype with some text that either wasn't translated or needs to be polished up still, but it also has some of Treasure's debug functions still enabled, like this pre-populated save menu so they could load the game up to specific points for whatever they were testing. Michael Shorrock had development boards for a few unreleased versions in progress, like a port of the puzzle game Wild Snake by Bulletproof Software, and an American version of the European Mega Drive game Yogi Bear Cartoon Capers, just referred to as Yogi Bear here. But there's two prototypes we really want to put the spotlight on. The first, also from Michael Shorrock, is a build of a game that there's been plenty of open questions about: Popeye in High Seas Hijinks by American Technos. Some footage of this game has popped up over the years, usually under the more generic title Popeye the Sailor. This build is much further along than any of the footage out there. There's multiple levels, there's intro cutscenes, it has a nice simple combat system where you can either punch enemies or throw wiffle eggs at them. We went ahead and looked it up, and these are apparently made by Bernice the Wiffle Hen, who is a minor character of the Popeye comics. While we don't know why or when this game was cancelled, this is surprisingly polished and close to completion. It looks like the developer, Beachport Entertainment Group, got in some hot legal water later on. So maybe some dicey, fraud-adjacent things were happening over at Beachport when this was being made. Who knows? I actually want to take a second to show you the prototype board that Popeye came on. This is one of the few physical props we have for this video. Most of what we got from Michael Shorrock was actually loaned to us so we could digitize it. This is one of the few things that he outright gave to us. If you have not seen one of these boards before, just look at it, it's beautiful. More peculiar in this batch is a game that has never surfaced in any form, Shadows of the Wind by the British company Images Software. It was also called Treasures of China, according to the ROM header. From what we've seen in British game magazines, this was supposedly announced for a whole bunch of platforms, but this Mega Drive prototype is the first playable version we know of. This seems to be an actual prototype, like not the phrase we all use to describe development builds of games, but an actual prototype. There's only one level with no ending, it's very early with some major optimizations still to go, but we can still get a good sense of what they were trying to do with this. You can open up a menu that lets you choose between different magic spells, which it appears you would be able to level up, and there's also an inventory system that would do something, it's not totally clear. Based on this limited prototype, you can imagine what the final game would have been, which I assume was the goal of this prototype. It's possible this was made as a proof of concept to get funding or a publishing deal, but for now, this build is basically all we know about this game. Now, any one of those prototypes we just talked about, we could have spent like 5 to 10 minutes on. It could have been its own entire video, but we've got to keep going because we've saved the biggest stuff for last. As I mentioned, we recovered multiple previously undumped Sega Channel releases. And we're going to start with the big one. You know it, you love it, you've been asking for it. It's Garfield Caught in the Act, The Lost Levels. Garfield Caught in the Act for Sega Genesis had a few levels that got left out from the final game, but they did end up seeing the light of day in the Sega Channel exclusive Lost Levels expansion. Since the Lost Levels haven't been available since Sega Channel was operating, they've been the subject of speculation for many years, so let's clear up what's actually in here. There's 3 levels in this ROM. A Viking level, widely reported to be called Bonehead the Barbarian. The intro screen for this level was actually misconfigured and it has the wrong title and palette, so we're going to assume the internet is right about what this should be called. The second level is Alien Landscape, which did come out in the PC version of Caught in the Act. And finally, there's a cut sequence from the Casablanca level with a moving train on a multi-layered pseudo 3D train track. Contrary to some reports, 2 additional stages that were mentioned in previews for Caught in the Act, Robin Hood and Ancient Rome, do not appear in the Lost levels. These 3 levels were packaged together as a linear game, and for a game called The Lost Levels, this package is pretty close to being the best version of itself. At the start of each level, the developers offer a little bit of commentary explaining what their intent was, or just the fact that they're proud of the stage you're about to play, despite it being cut. There's even a little narrative about how Garfield is lost, and the enemies are trying to keep Garfield, quote, at his lost status, which does make it a lot more fun in a meta way to have recovered this game. The thing is, when you play these levels, it becomes pretty clear why they got cut. Each level has an overbearing gimmick that's not especially fun to play with. Bonehead the Barbarian has these slippery ice half-pipes, which even the developers acknowledged didn't quite live up to their hopes. The train sequence comes off maybe the poorest of all. In this stage, Garfield has to board a fast-moving train and dodge obstacles along the track. You can tell what they were attempting to execute here, but it's so fast and so difficult, it would take most players dozens of tries just to get close to beating this one. So in terms of pure entertainment, it's a mixed bag, but I'm glad the developers got to showcase their work this way. This must be one of the first console games made entirely out of cut content, and even the minimal developer commentary makes this an early template for the sort of documentary game collections that are more common nowadays. This is the sort of bite-sized treat that a service like Sega Channel was perfect for. If you know what you're doing, you can get through the Lost levels in about half an hour. There's no way they could have justified releasing this as a standalone cartridge. But it does make a lot of sense to repurpose leftover content like this as a bonus for subscribers to Sega Channel, where there's no sticker price and no manufacturing costs. It's almost like a DLC pack for Garfield Caught in the Act. To go for kind of a deep pull, it reminds me of the downloadable game Aegis Wing from the early days of Xbox Live Arcade. That game was an intern project that Microsoft put out for free with a little note saying they just wanted to share it with you because it was fun. Like Aegis Wing, the Garfield Lost Level Pack is the kind of unique, small-scale project that would have been impossible to release under the old retail model of game publishing. It shows what avenues Sega might have ended up exploring more with digital distribution if they'd had the chance. All right, let's put Garfield back down. No! And that's not all. Remember, I said we recovered multiple Sega Channel exclusive games. There's a few new ports of existing games in here, one for the puzzle game Breakthrough, which never came out on cartridge but did make it to Sega Channel, and this is a strange one. There's an exclusive Sega Genesis port of the Berenstain Bears A School Day, which was originally for the Sega Pico, the educational game system for children. I guess they really were trying to get a broader family audience for their services. They were porting over Pico games. This is the only time we know of ever that a Pico game was released on another platform. To be fair here, the Pico does use the same internals as the Sega Genesis, so this may have been an easy port. In fact, the ROM is so similar to the Pico version that most emulators actually read it as a Pico game and crash when they try to run it. We were able to get it running using the emulator Gens, if you really want to try this one. We also recovered the final version of the Waterworld game for Sega Genesis. There have been a few prototypes of this one floating around for a while now. Floating around like Waterworld, like it's floating. But this is the final version that was actually distributed through Sega Channel. We're not sure what changes were made from prototype to final, but there do seem to be large data differences between the ROMs. For the 2 Waterworld fans out there, we look forward to your research. And another surprise, we recovered the Sega Channel exclusive game Iron Hammer. Now, this is kind of a full circle moment for us because Iron Hammer began life as a title for the unreleased Sega VR peripheral. You might remember that some years ago, our volunteer conservator, Rich Whitehouse, here again in this video, managed to reverse engineer the standard for Sega VR using the source code for a canceled game called Nuclear Rush. Iron Hammer looks quite similar to Nuclear Rush in that it's a first-person vehicular combat game, but it is so much smoother and more performant and just more fun. We checked in with Rich, and from his analysis, he believes VR support was never actually implemented in Iron Hammer, which goes a long way to explaining why it performs so well. Also the fact that it's a finished game and not a work in progress. So it's not exactly a lost Sega VR game, but even without the futuristic headset, it's still pretty cool. It's the sort of visually intensive 3D game that you wouldn't expect out of the Sega Genesis, and it is impressive to see in motion. Now, surely you're thinking, surely that's it. They don't have any more games to show today. Well, folks, yes, we yabba dabba do. Maybe it's nobody's idea of a holy grail, but the Flintstones movie game by Ocean was the last undumped Sega Channel exclusive game, and as far as we can tell, the last unique undumped Sega Genesis release in the United States, period. Now, let's be clear here, this is not a great game. In fact, it's actually a worse version of a game. A Super Nintendo version of the Flintstones did come out, and it is not especially beloved, and even compared to that, the Genesis version has major shortcomings. The controls are stiff, the game physics are off, performance is all over the place, some backgrounds and graphical effects are just plain missing, and changes have been made to the levels to work around these limitations. It's obviously a product of compromise on time and budget. Now, what's interesting is this final version of the Flintstones for Genesis is in a much worse state than the prototype version that showed up online a few years ago on Hidden Palace. Comparing their credits, it seems that the original version was developed in-house at Ocean, but the final version that was distributed through Sega Channel was ported by Fully High Tech, the company that developed the Sega Channel Web Blaster. To my eyes, it seems like this port was totally redone from scratch. We reached out to Paul Robinson, who was credited as the Sega programmer on Ocean's original Genesis build of the Flintstones. He told us that the Genesis version was cancelled after he left Ocean to go work at another studio, Visual Concepts. We don't know why development started over with another company rather than building on what Ocean had already done, and we didn't hear back from alumni at Fully High Tech in time for this video to go live. Our educated guess is that much like the Lost Levels of Garfield, the opportunity came up to repurpose an abandoned project as a Sega Channel exclusive, and in this case development was farmed out to Sega's contractor of choice. We're hoping somebody else can piece together the rest of this story, because, I'll be honest, I've spent more time thinking about the Flintstones in the last 2 months than I have in my preceding 36 years on this earth, and I don't want to think about the Flintstones anymore. If there's one thing the Flintstones movie game is known for today, however, it's the famous unused Song 2 in the game's sound test. This ethereal, very un-Flintstones-like tune was written by Ocean composer Dean Evans while he was playing around with their internal music sequencing tool. And in case you're wondering, yes, this song did end up in the Genesis version too. Dean Evans told us that he had no involvement with the Genesis port, which looks to credit the music to Colin Hughes at a company called Tech in the UK. They must have been contracted separately by Ocean, maybe even before Fully High Tech took over the project. All the music from the Super Nintendo version was converted over, even though some of it doesn't actually get used in this version, possibly by mistake. But that does mean that this unused song got ported over too. Adding up everything we've shown in this video, that is 142 new ROMs from Sega Channel. There were also 2 ROMs from Michael Shorrock's CD that were recovered last year in that CD that was found by Rising from Ruins, but nobody actually seemed to notice, so we're gonna count those too. Sega Channel data has been hard to come across because it wasn't stored permanently on the adapter cartridge. With this recovery, we've gone from almost no Sega Channel ROMs being saved to almost every Sega Channel ROM being saved. So what's even left at this point? Well, checking against all the information that Sega Channel Guy found and the reports that have showed up on Sonic Retro, we're down to just a couple game variants. These are test drives and contest versions, so it's just slightly modified editions of games that have already been dumped. Of course, we're also missing any Sega Channel menus after July 4th, 1997, along with the vast majority of PAL region, Canadian, and South American menu data. We have no idea how many of those are even out there, but for the most part, they were not among these data backups. And that is Sega Channel. Like, that's Sega Channel. That's it. Like, that's all the outstanding game data for Sega Channel. That's almost everything related to Sega Channel. After everything we've helped preserve and share here, from early system software to audience surveys and commercials, and entire games that we thought had been lost, we now have the clearest impression ever of what Sega Channel was, what they wanted it to be, who was using it, all the places their ambitions stretched maybe a little too far, and what playing Sega Channel actually meant to the user. Again, all the documents we've shown today are now accessible in our digital archive in the Michael Shorrock collection. All the ROM data we showed today will be available on Gaming Alexandria. We will have the link in the video description as soon as it is available. As we're wrapping up here, I want to take a second to reflect on how we even got to this point. We got here because, well, frankly, because people like you trust us. Sega Channel guy got in touch with us because he knew we could help. Michael Shorrock worked with us because we met him at the 2024 Game Developers Conference and we put on an exhibit that we did thanks to your support. And we showed off at that exhibit. We had artifacts that we got back in 2016 when our founder, Frank Cifaldi, went out to North Dakota and met with a bunch of teachers who entrusted him with their material. There's a long story here, and it's all about trust and relationships. People often ask us how the preservation of video game history happens and how we find lost games. We know there's a lot of interest in that area. It's about people. None of this happens in a vacuum. None of this happens without each other. It's because we're collaborating with developers and with members of the community to work towards a common goal, to build out a more complete picture of what video game history is. So I want to make sure we thank the folks who made this possible. Obviously, Michael Shorrock, Sega Channel guy. Thanks to Sega Retro, the Cutting Room Floor, and Hidden Palace for thoroughly documenting everything we've known about Sega Channel up to this point, and having extensive lists of checksums for known ROMs that we could compare against. Hey, have fun updating your wikis with all this new info. Thanks to Rising from Ruins and Nathan, going by InfoChunk, for putting all the pieces in place to crack the Sega Channel data format. Thanks to Hubs over at Gaming Alexandria for working with us to share this enormous collection of files. Even Rob from the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment. He was at the 2024 Game Developers Conference, and Michael Shorrock offhandedly mentioned to him that he saw a photo of himself at our booth, and Rob made sure that Michael came back and talked with us. All of this is important. And of course, we have to thank Chuck at Sidex for his work for so many years assisting the preservation community in recovering data. I know a lot of folks have really been excited to learn more about Sega Channel, and I hope the enthusiasm around this really is a testament to how much his work mattered to this community. I'm sure everyone is excited to finally get to try Garfield the Lost Levels, and to a lesser extent, the Flintstones. But I want to leave you thinking about the bridges that had to be built and maintained to get us there. I hope that stays with you. The other thing I want to leave you with is that the Super Nintendo passwords for Flintstones do work on the Genesis version. So just skip the whole Bedrock section with Fred in the car. It's awful. It's the worst section of the game. No one will judge you. It's fine.